is the significance of the various references to the book of life in relation to salvation? And I say in relation to the non-believer and in relation to the believer. Is the book of life a record of all the people who are saved? We probably assume so. Is the book of life a record of all the people? Because sometimes we do sing and say and confess, my name is in the book of life. Now, which names are in the book of life? Is it the names of people who are saved? Is it everybody? Or what? Who qualifies to be in the records of the book of life? Could it be a record of all the people for whom Christ died from all over the world? Every person for whom Christ died, does that qualify someone to be in the book of life? Let me share a bit of passages in the Bible referring to the book of life. And I'll read very quickly. Psalm 69, verse 28. Let them be blotted out of the book of the living. That's David. Let them be blotted out from the book of the living and not be written with the righteous. Two things David said there. Blot them from the book of the living, and then let their names not be written with the righteous. Now, Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. Now, at that time, Michael, the great prince, who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise. And there will be a time of distress, such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. I'm talking of references to the book. I'll explain later because there are various books. But I want to emphasize on the book of life. Now, although the word life or living is not used here, in other words, it says the book of the living. Although the book of life or the word life is not used here, or living, it is not used here. It is part of the same concept. When it says the book of the living or the book of life, it is one and the same concept. Now, when you go to Luke chapter 10, verse 20, this is Jesus saying, when the disciples came back and reported everything that has happened when he sent them on a commission. When they came back and said, oh, even the demons are obeying us. And we are commanding them and they are hearing our commands. And people are being healed of their diseases. And Jesus says in Luke chapter 10, verse 20, responding to them, nevertheless, do not rejoice in this. In other words, do not rejoice in people being healed. Do not rejoice in demons obeying you. Do not rejoice in everything you have accomplished. Do not even rejoice that the spirits are subject to you, but rather rejoice because your names are written in heaven. So many people are running after miracles today. Many people are running after prophecies today. Many people are running after people today. But our joy should be that our names are written in the book of life. And what we should guard jealously is to ensure that your name remains in the book of life. I'll come later and explain if there is a possibility that your name was in the book of life and was removed or was blotted. There is a possibility. But I'll come to that later. Now, When Jesus says your names are written in heaven, this is a perfect tense. And looks at an abiding condition. In other words, this is evidently another reference to the book of life when it says our names are written in heaven. Now, Philippians chapter 4, verse 3. Paul says, and I urge you also, true companion, help these women who labored with me in the gospel. With Clement also, Paul is talking about his companions in the mission world. I urge you also, true companion, help these women who labored with me in the gospel, and with Clement also, and the rest of my fellow workers, whose names are in the book of life. This is Paul talking about his companions, whom he is confident that their names are in the book of life. Now, Paul speaks of the rest of his fellow workers, whose names he believes are in the book of life. All right, Revelation, I'm not going to share very many. Revelation chapter 3 verse 5, and I mentioned this earlier. He who overcomes shall be clothed in white garments, and I will not, this is God promising, this is Christ promising, he who overcomes shall be clothed in white garments, and I will not blot out his name from the book of life. But I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. Again, Revelation chapter 13 verse 8. Before I finish, I'll talk about these two verses before I conclude. Revelation chapter 3 verse 5 and Revelation chapter 13 verse 8. That's what I'm going to read now, because there is a kind of confusion between these two verses. There are things sometimes we don't seem to understand. And some of these things we do not understand. As human beings, we use our brains kind to understand. And by using our brains, we go wrong. And even theologians disagree on some of these things. And so I'll talk about these two verses before I finish. Because there is a kind of question that we may ask ourselves about the two. Now, Revelation chapter 13 verse 8. All who dwell on earth will worship him. Him is the beast. All who dwell on the earth will worship him, or worship the beast, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world. Did you get that? Whose names have not been written. Okay? The other one said the names are written in the book of life. This one says the names are not written in the book of life. Right. Revelation chapter 17 verse 8. I'll come to these verses later. The beast that you saw was, and it is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. And those who dwell on earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world. When they see the beast that was, and is not, and yet is. I'll explain this before I finish now. Finally, two more verses. Revelation chapter 20 verse 12. And I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God, and the books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works, by the things which were written in the books. Did you hear that? There is a book, and there are books in that verse. So there are books, and there is a book. There is a book of life, and there are other books. Again, Revelation chapter 20, verse 15, the same chapter. And anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. Sorry, I gave you so many verses, about 9 verses, but I wanted to give you the verses that many times relates to the book of life. Now, let me now share with you the categories of books in Scripture. Because there are different kinds of books. So that when you read Scripture and you read about a book, you don't confuse that book with the book of life. Because there are different categories of books as well. And I'll share with you about 5 different categories of books. Now, in addition to the book of life, there are other categories of records or books mentioned in Scripture. By the way, why should God keep a record? God knows everything, isn't it? God understands everything. He knows everybody by name. Why should God keep a record? What is the necessity of God keeping a record? He knows everything. He understands everybody. Why would he keep a record? Like that? Because of the day of judgment? Yes. And the other thing, of course, is God works by delegation. Everything God does, he does through people. So when people keep records, in fact, in this country, there are records everywhere. When you meet a police officer, he asks you, what is your DOP? That's the first thing. What is your DOP? The moment you say your DOP, everything is open. All the channels in this country are open. Because that is the key that opens every other channel. And so, there are records kept by nations. There are records kept by governments. There are records kept by civil servants. There are records kept by councils. There are records kept by churches. Everywhere. Because we do what we do by delegation. So God himself knows everything. But because he works through us, we keep the records. And he values those records. So, I want to share about 5 different categories of books. The first one is the Book of Wars. W-A-R-S. Vita. The Book of Wars. Numbers 21 verse 14. Therefore, it is said in the Book of Wars of the Lord. It is Numbers 21, 14. Therefore, it is said in the Book of Wars of the Lord. What was the Book of Wars about? It was a collection of war songs. You know, when people go to war, they sing songs of victory. Sometimes they sing songs to scare their enemies when they march towards them. So there are those songs, all of them were recorded. And so the Book of Wars is a collection of war songs which were celebrating the glorious acts of God on behalf of Israel. So Israel kept a record of the Book of Wars. And every time they went to war, they had a record of these songs. The songs they sang when they were going around Jericho. The songs they sang when they overcame their enemies. They had all these records. So that's a different kind of book. Now, the second kind of book is the Book of Jasher. Jasher, J-A-S-H-E-R. J-A-S-H-E-R. The Book of Jasher. What is the Book of Jasher? Joshua, chapter 10, verse 13. I don't know if Jasher has anything to do with Joshua. But in Joshua, chapter 10, verse 13. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped. What does science tell us? What moves? Is it the sun or the planets? According to science, what moves? Is it the sun or the planets? The planets. Because they say the planets go around the sun. So the sun doesn't move. According to science. What about according to Joshua? the sun moves and the moon moves. So I don't know. I don't know if we are going to believe the scientists or believe Joshua. But Joshua says the sun stood still. So is it the earth then that did not move? Or is it the sun that actually stopped? Anyway, let's not get into details about that. But the sun stood still and the moon stopped till the people had revenge upon their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Joshua? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and did not hasten to go down for about the whole day. In other words, that day, a day was 48 hours. Just like according to Israel anyway, a day is 12 hours, not 24. According to Israel, a day is 12 hours. So that day, the day was 24 hours. So it was written in the book of Joshua. In 2 Samuel chapter 1 verse 18, then David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. And he told them to teach the children of Judah the song of the bow, B-O-W. Indeed, it is written in the book of Joshua. Now the book was an early record or an early chronicle of the history of Israel. So the book of Joshua was a record of the early history or chronicles of the history of Israel. That's the second book. Now that book is a book of remembrance. You remember the old man who was promoted after the king did not sleep the whole night. And he went into the archives and started reading and read a book about someone who rescued the king when he was supposed to have been killed. And asked, was that man rewarded? And the man was supposed to be dying the following day. You remember the story of Mordecai. He was supposed to be dying the following day. And then the king doesn't sleep until he reads that. If there were no records, Mordecai would have died. But because of the records, the king read, who was this man rewarded? And then he called the following day, even before the man is dead, he called a meeting. And the man was rewarded. So, the book of remembrance. Now, Malachi chapter 3, verse 16 to 17. Then those who feared the Lord spoke to one another, and the Lord listened and heard them. So, a book of remembrance was written before him for those who fear the Lord and who meditate on his name. The book of remembrance. Malachi chapter 3, verse 16 to 17. Now, Psalms 56, verse 8, again of the book of remembrance. You number my wanderings, put my tears into your bottle. Are they not in your book? Again, this is David now talking to God and telling him, you know the number of wanderings that I have made, moving from one place to another. And I know every time I cry, you put my tears in your bottle. Are all these records not in your book for you to remember? In other words, a book of remembrance. So every time we do something good, it is in the book of remembrance. And one time when you are not able to do anything, you start reminding God. Go to the book of remembrance. And remember what happened. Book of remembrance. The fourth book is the book of those physically alive. A record of those physically alive. Exodus chapter 32, verses 32 and 33. Exodus 32, 32 to 33. Yet now, if you will forgive their sin, this is Moses talking to God. If you will forgive their sin, but if not, I pray, blot me out of your book which you have written. Hey, this is Moses now pleading for Israel. This is when they made an idol. And God was so displeased with them. And now Moses comes in between Israel and God, and he's pleading with God. And he says, God, if you will forgive these people for doing what they have done, but if you do not forgive them, I pray, blot me out of your book which you have written. And the Lord said to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot him out of my book. That is critical for you to understand. That your name may be written in the book of life. But if you sin against God, he can blot your name out of the book of life. That's what Moses was told. Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot him out of my book. And that does not mean every time you sin, your name is blotted out. Because again, we have a formula that God has given us. When you know you have sinned, and you know you have done something against God, you go back to him in confession. Why do you think God ever said he has found a man after his own heart? David. Is David a man? Is David a man you can say is after God's heart? Somebody who desires to take away somebody else's wife? And then he kills the husband deliberately and takes the wife home? And he conceals that. He doesn't want people to know. But anyway, you cannot hide anything from God. Because you know what David did? He wrote a letter. And who carried the letter? The very soldier who he wanted to dead. Because the wife of that soldier is the wife he took. So he gives the soldier the letter. The letter is written to the commander in the army, Joab. Joab, when you receive this letter from this young man, put him where the battle is fiercest in the front, where he has no defense, and let him die. Literally, that is what he was saying. And of course, who was the commander in chief? David. So the commander in the army had to do that. And so, now this very innocent soldier carries the letter and gives this to Joab. Now, do you know David's life was at stake? Because every time Joab was alive, Joab knew what the king did. So every time Joab would face the king and tell him, you know, you are a murderer. You are a murderer because you sent me the letter. I still have the letter, and you forced me to kill the soldier. David knew that. At the bottom of his heart, he knew that. That's not a good life to live. But it's the same person. God says, I found a man after my own heart. Why? Because David knew the secret of confession. And that is what most of us don't know. And that's why we lose. And now this is Moses. God says, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot him out of my book. Now, Exodus 17:14. Then the Lord said to Moses, write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. There will be nobody called Amalek under heaven. I'm going to blot them out completely. That's a whole race killed. Because they fought Israel. And God promised He is going to wipe out every relative, everybody related to Amalek. Now Deuteronomy 29:20, the Lord would not spare him, for then the anger of the Lord and his jealousy would burn against that man, and every curse that is written in this book would settle on him, and the Lord would blot out his name from